Senator Kennedy destroys Elizabeth Warren. If you don't like America, leave. The Grand Chamber of the United States Senate buzzed with an electric undercurrent, the kind that precedes a storm. Marble columns loomed overhead, their stoic presence a silent witness to countless battles of words and ideals. But today, the air felt heavier, charged with anticipation. Senators sat in their leather chairs, some flipping through notes, others exchanging hushed whispers, their eyes darting toward the center of the room where two titans of American politics were about to collide. At one end stood Senator John Neely Kennedy, the pride of Louisiana, his weathered face etched with the wisdom of a man who'd seen the world through the lens of a small-town upbringing and an Oxford education. At 73, Kennedy was a folksy Southerner with a razor-sharp intellect, a conservative firebrand whose drawl could charm a crowd before slicing through an opponent's argument like a hot knife through butter. Across the chamber, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts prepared her notes, her sharp eyes framed by her signature glasses, her posture radiating the unyielding resolve of a woman who'd built a career on challenging the powerful. The topic of today's hearing was economic reform. But everyone in the room knew this was no ordinary policy debate. This was a clash of visions, a showdown between two Americas, and the sparks were about to fly. Kennedy adjusted his tie, a subtle gesture that belied the storm brewing within him. He'd been in politics long enough to know when a moment mattered, and this was one of those moments. Born in Zachary, Louisiana, he'd grown up in a world of hard work and simple values, where his father, a farmer, and his mother, a schoolteacher, taught him that America was a land of opportunity for those willing to earn it. His journey from a small-town boy to a Vanderbilt-educated lawyer, an Oxford scholar, and eventually a U.S. Senator since 2017 had only deepened his belief in the American dream. He'd served as Louisiana's state treasurer, switched parties from Democrat to Republican, and built a reputation as a defender of free enterprise and individual liberty. His speeches, peppered with homespun metaphors and biting wit, had made him a darling of conservative voters and a thorn in the side of progressives. Today, he was ready to draw a line in the sand. Warren, on the other hand, was no stranger to high-stakes battles. A former Harvard law professor and the architect of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, she'd spent decades fighting for the underdog workers, crushed by debt, families squeezed by corporate greed, students drowning in loan payments. Her progressive vision of America was one where the system didn't just reward the wealthy, but lifted everyone, where fairness wasn't a buzzword, but a policy goal. Elected to the Senate in 2013, she'd become a leading voice of the Democratic Party's left wing, her fiery speeches and relentless advocacy earning her both devoted followers and fierce critics. Her latest proposal, the centerpiece of today's hearing, was a bold tax reform plan, a wealth tax on the ultra-rich and a corporate tax hike to fund universal health care, tuition-free college, and green energy initiatives. To Warren, it was a moral imperative, a way to level a playing field tilted toward the elite. To Kennedy, it was a direct assault on the principles that made America great. The hearing began with the sharp rap of the gavel, and the room fell silent. The committee chair, a gray-haired senator with a knack for keeping order, outlined the agenda, a discussion on economic equity and tax policy. Warren was called to speak first. She rose, her voice clear and commanding, cutting through the chamber like a beacon. "My colleagues," she began, "we stand at a crossroads. For too long, the American economy has been rigged to benefit the top 1%, while the rest of our citizens, hard-working families, single parents, young people starting out are left to scrape by. The wealth gap is not just a statistic, it's a moral failure. My proposal is simple. Tax the ultra-wealthy, close corporate loopholes, and invest in the future of every American. Healthcare for all, education without debt, a planet we can pass on to our children. This isn't radicalates justice. The room stirred. Some senators nodded in agreement, their pens scribbling notes. Others, particularly from the Republican side, shifted uncomfortably. Kennedy sat still, his fingers steepled, his eyes locked on Warren. He'd heard this rhetoric before: class warfare dressed up as fairness, government overreach masquerading as compassion. He waited as Warren continued, her voice rising with conviction. The billionaires and corporations have had their day. They've built fortunes on the backs of workers who can't afford rent, on communities poisoned by pollution, on a system that rewards greed over grit. My plan will raise billions to rebuild the middle class, to give every child a shot at the American dream, not just the children of the elite. This is what America should be, nation that works for everyone. Applause broke out from the gallery, where activists and supporters had gathered. The chair banged the gavel for order, but the energy in the room was palpable. Warren sat down, her expression resolute, knowing she'd struck a chord. But Kennedy was already preparing his response, his mind racing through decades of debates, courtrooms, and campaign trails. He'd faced opponents like Warren before, idealists who believed the government could solve every problem, who saw America's flaws as proof of its failure rather than challenges to overcome. He stood, his movements deliberate, and the room hushed once more. Mr. Chairman, esteemed colleagues, Kennedy began, his Louisiana drawl filling the chamber like a warm breeze. I want to thank Senator Warren for her passion. She's got a fire in her belly, and I respect that. But I'm afraid she's got it all wrong about this country. He paused, letting the words hang in the air, his eyes sweeping the room. I grew up in a small town in Louisiana, where folks didn't have much, but they had pride. They didn't wait for handouts. They worked, they dreamed, they built. That's the America I know. The America where a kid from nowhere can become a senator, where a farmer's son can stand here and speak for millions. Senator Warren's plan, well-meaning as it may be, isn't the answer. It's a wrecking ball aimed at the very engine of our prosperity. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Kennedy's voice grew firmer, his tone shifting from folksy to forceful. This wealth tax, this corporate tax hike's not about fairness. It's about punishing success. You want to tax the rich? Fine. But who do you think creates jobs? Who builds businesses, hires workers, drives innovation? It's not the government, it's the entrepreneurs, the risk-takers, the people who get up every morning and bet on themselves. Senator Warren wants to take their money and give it to bureaucrats to spend. I say that's not justice, that's theft. The room erupted in a mix of gasps and scattered applause. Warren's face tightened, her pen pausing mid-note. Kennedy pressed on, his words now a steady drumbeat. I've read Senator Warren's plan, and it's not just about taxes. It's about control. She wants the government to decide who wins and who loses, who gets a leg up and who gets knocked down. That's not the American way. In America, we don't tear down the successful to make everyone else feel better. We lift everyone up by giving them the freedom to chase their dreams. Her plan would choke that freedom, strangle the spirit that makes this country the greatest on earth. He turned slightly, addressing Warren directly for the first time. Senator Warren, you talk about the middle class, and I believe you care about them, but your policies would hurt the very people you claim to help. Small businesses would close under the weight of new taxes. Jobs would disappear. Families would struggle. And for what? So the government can play Robin Hood, taking from one to give to another? That's not how we fix inequality. We fix it by unleashing opportunity, by trusting people to make their own way, not by building a bigger bureaucracy. The chamber was now a tinderbox, every word from Kennedy adding fuel to the fire. Warren leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, ready to respond. But Kennedy wasn't done. He lowered his voice, adopting the cadence of a preacher delivering a hard truth. I've been around long enough to know that America isn't perfect. We've got our problems: poverty, inequality, folks who feel left behind. But the answer isn't to remake the country in the image of some socialist utopia. The answer is to double down on what's always worked: freedom, hard work, and faith in the individual. Senator Warren, I fear your vision of America is one where the government is the hero, and the people are just along for the ride. That's not the America I love, and I don't think it's the America most folks in this room love either. He paused, his gaze steady on Warren, then delivered the line that would echo beyond the chamber. If you don't believe in the America that rewards grit and gumption, that celebrates the individual over the collective, then I've got to ask, why are you here? If you don't like the America that's given millions a shot at greatness, maybe you ought to find a place that suits you better. The words landed like a thunderclap. The room froze, senators exchanging stunned glances, aides scribbling furiously. Warren's jaw clenched, her composure tested but intact. The gallery buzzed with whispers, some outraged, others nodding in approval. The chair banged the gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. Kennedy sat down, his expression unreadable. While Warren prepared her rebuttal, her mind racing to counter not just his arguments, but the personal challenge he'd thrown at her feet. The hearing continued, but the focus had shifted. This was no longer about tax policy, it was about the soul of America, about two visions so fundamentally opposed that compromise seemed impossible. Outside the chamber, reporters scrambled to their laptops, headlines already forming. Kennedy to Warren! Leave America! Social media lit up, with conservatives hailing Kennedy's bluntness and progressives decrying his attack. The battle lines were drawn, and the war was just beginning. As the session adjourned for a break, Kennedy gathered his papers, his face betraying no hint of doubt. He'd said what needed saying, or so he believed. Warren, meanwhile, stood with her aides, her voice low but firm, already planning her next move. The clash had ignited a fire that would burn far beyond the Senate floor, exposing the deep philosophical divide in a nation grappling with its identity. For Kennedy, it was a stand for the America he'd always known, a land of freedom and opportunity. For Warren, it was a fight for an America that could be a nation that lived up to its promise for all its people. The stage was set for a reckoning, and neither side was backing down. The Senate chamber was a cauldron of barely contained energy. The echoes of Senator John Neely Kennedy's provocative challenge. If you don't like the America that rewards grit and gumption, maybe you ought to find a place that suits you better, still reverberating off the marble walls. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next salvo in a battle that had transcended policy and become a referendum on the nation's soul. Senators sat stiffly in their leather chairs, some clutching notes, others exchanging furtive glances, their expressions a mix of unease and fascination. Aides hovered, scribbling updates or whispering to their bosses, sensing a moment that would dominate news cycles for days. The gallery, packed with journalists, activists, students, and curious citizens, buzzed with hushed excitement, smartphones discreetly recording every gesture, every word. At the center of this storm stood two titans: Kennedy, the Louisiana conservative, whose folksy drawl masked a razor-sharp mind, and Elizabeth Warren, the Massachusetts progressive, whose fiery resolve made her a beacon for some and a lightning rod for others. Kennedy's words had landed like a thunderbolt, and now all eyes turned to Warren, whose response could either quell the escalating conflict or set the chamber ablaze. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, his hands folded, his face a study in calm confidence. His sharp blue eyes, framed by a weathered face, scanned the room, missing nothing. He was no stranger to high-stakes debates, and today he was in his element, ready to defend the America he believed in: an America of individual liberty, free markets, and limited government. His earlier challenge to Warren had been deliberate. A line in the sand meant to expose what he saw as the dangerous idealism of her progressive agenda. He knew his words had stirred the pot, and he was prepared for the fallout, his mind already anticipating her counterattack. The gallery's murmurs, the senator's sidelong glances, the rustle of paper saw were background noise to him. This was a fight for principles, and he was ready to swing. Warren, across the chamber, radiated a different kind of energy, controlled, intense, and unyielding. Her glasses glinted under the chamber's chandeliers as she organized her notes with meticulous care, her movements betraying a flicker of indignation beneath her composed exterior. She was a warrior in her own right, a former Harvard professor who'd built a career on challenging the powerful. From Wall Street titans to entrenched political elites, her wealth tax proposal, the heart of today's hearing, was her boldest gambit yet. A plan to tax the ultra-rich and corporations, to fund universal health care, tuition-free college, and green energy initiatives. To her, it was a moral imperative, a way to dismantle a system that rewarded greed while leaving millions behind. Kennedy's accusation that she didn't belong in the America he cherished had struck a nerve, not because it wounded her personally, but because it dismissed the struggles of the people she fought for. As the chair called her to speak, she rose, her posture commanding, her silence a prelude to a storm. "Mr. Chairman, my esteemed colleagues, and Senator Kennedy," Warren began, her voice clear and resonant, cutting through the chamber like a blade. "I've listened to my colleague from Louisiana paint a picture of America as a land of endless opportunity, where hard work and determination are all you need to succeed. It's a beautiful vision, and I wish it were true for every American. But let's pull back the curtain on that story. For millions of our citizens, single parents working 2 jobs, students drowning in debt, families bankrupted by a single medical bill, the American dream is a mirage. They're not failing because they lack effort. They're failing because the system is rigged against them." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room, lingering briefly on Kennedy, who met her gaze without flinching. "My plan, the one Senator Kennedy calls a wrecking ball, is about fixing that system. It's about making sure every American has a fair shot, not just the wealthy, not just the connected, but everyone." The gallery erupted in applause, a wave of support that forced the chair to bang the gavel for order. Warren's words were striking a chord, her progressive vision resonating with those who saw inequality as a betrayal of America's promise. She pressed on, her voice rising with passion. "Senator Kennedy says my wealth tax is theft, that it punishes success. Let's talk about success. When corporations stash billions in offshore accounts while small businesses pay their fair share, is that success? When billionaires pay a lower tax rate than teachers or nurses, is that fair? My plan targets the ultra-rich, the top 0.1%, who've built fortunes not just on hard work, but on a system that tilts in their favor. The revenue will fund healthcare for every American, college without debt, clean energy to save our planet. This isn't about tearing anyone down. It's about lifting everyone up. That's not socialism. That's justice." Senators on the Democratic side nodded vigorously, some jotting notes, others exchanging looks of approval. Even a few moderates seemed swayed, their pens pausing as they considered her argument. Kennedy's fingers tapped lightly on his desk, a subtle sign he was itching to respond. Warren's rhetoric was powerful, reframing the debate as a fight for fairness rather than a clash of ideologies. But she wasn't finished. Turning directly to Kennedy, she delivered a pointed challenge. "Senator Kennedy, you speak of freedom with such conviction. But whose freedom are you defending? The freedom of corporations to pollute our rivers and exploit our workers? The freedom of the ultra-wealthy to dodge taxes while the middle class foots the bill? Your America seems to work beautifully for those at the top, but what about the rest of us? The factory workers laid off after decades of loyalty? The young people who can't afford to start a family? The families choosing between groceries and medicine? I'm not here to destroy America. I'm here to make it live up to its ideals, for every single one of us. The chamber buzzed. A cacophony of cheers from Warren's supporters and grumbles from Kennedy's allies. The chair called for quiet, but the energy was electric. The room a battlefield of ideas. Warren sat down, her expression resolute, knowing she'd landed her blows. But Kennedy was already rising, his movements slow and deliberate, a faint smile curling his lips as he prepared to counter. "Mr. Chairman," he began, his Louisiana drawl rolling through the room like a slow-moving river. "I've got to give Senator Warren credit. She's got away with words that could sell ice to a penguin." A ripple of laughter broke the tension, mostly from the Republican side. But even some Democrats cracked smiles. Kennedy's eyes locked on Warren, his tone shifting from playful to piercing. But words don't change facts. And the fact is, her plan is a house of cards built on a foundation of wishful thinking. He paced slightly, his hands gesturing as if addressing a town hall back in Louisiana. "Senator Warren talks about fairness. And who doesn't want fairness? But let's cut through the smoke and mirrors. Her wealth tax isn't about helping the little guy, it's about strangling the folks who keep this country's engine running. You want to tax the rich? Fine, but those rich folks are the ones building businesses, hiring workers, driving the innovation that makes America the envy of the world. You don't help a struggling family by taxing their employer out of business. You don't create jobs by chasing companies overseas with higher taxes. You don't build a stronger economy by piling on regulations that choke small businesses. That's not fairness, that's a recipe for disaster." The room was now a tinderbox, every sentence from Kennedy stoking the flames. Warren scribbled notes, her face a mask of determination. But Kennedy was in his element, his blend of logic and Southern charm dismantling her lofty rhetoric. "I've seen what happens when the government gets too big," he continued, his voice dropping to a confiding tone, as if sharing a hard-earned truth. "It's like letting a bull loose in a china shop, everything gets smashed." Senator Warren's plan would have the government in every corner of your life, from your paycheck to your doctor's office, from your small business to your retirement savings. She calls it justice. I call it control. And I don't know about y'all, but I'd rather trust the American people to run their own lives than hand the reins to a bunch of bureaucrats in Washington. Laughter erupted from his allies, and even some moderates nodded, drawn in by his plain-spoken appeal. Kennedy's ability to ground the debate in everyday terms was working, making Warren's grand vision seem distant, impractical. But he wasn't done. He turned to face her directly, his voice steady but carrying a weight that silenced the room. "Senator Warren, you've got your vision for America, and you're entitled to it. But your vision looks like a place where success is a crime, where ambition gets you a tax bill instead of a paycheck, where the government's the answer to every problem under the sun. You say the system's rigged, and I'll grant you we've got work to do. But you don't fix a broken engine by tearing it apart, you tune it, you tweak it, you let it run. Your plan would junk the whole machine and replace it with something that's never worked anywhere it's been tried." He paused, letting the words sink in, then delivered the line that would ignite a firestorm. "If that's the America you're fighting for, Senator Warren, I've got to be honest, it's not the America that's made us great. It's not the America built on freedom, on the right to chase your own destiny, to rise or fall on your own terms. And if you don't believe in that America, if you think it's all wrong from the ground up, then maybe you ought to find a country that fits your blueprint." The words landed like a sledgehammer, the chamber falling into a stunned silence. Senators froze, their pens hovering over paper. The gallery gasped, whispers exploding into a low roar. Warren's eyes flashed with defiance, her jaw tightening, but she held her composure, refusing to flinch under the weight of the attack. The chair slammed the gavel, calling for an immediate recess. But the moment was already etched in stone. Kennedy's challenge, "Maybe you ought to find a country that fits your blueprint," was a gauntlet thrown, not just at Warren, but at the entire progressive movement she represented. Reporters in the gallery scrambled to their laptops, fingers flying as they drafted headlines that would set the internet ablaze. "Kennedy to Warren! Leave America!" Social media erupted, with conservatives hailing Kennedy's bluntness as a defense of American values, while progressives condemned him for what they saw as a divisive, personal attack. The chamber emptied slowly, senators murmuring to each other, aides rushing to spin the narrative for their side. Kennedy gathered his papers, his expression serene, as if he'd said nothing more controversial than a weather report. Warren, surrounded by aides, spoke in low, urgent tones, her face a mix of resolve and calculation, already plotting her next move. The hearing had become a microcosm of America's broader divided visions of the future, each claiming to represent the true spirit of the nation, locked in a struggle with no easy resolution. Kennedy's words had drawn a stark line, framing the debate as a choice between freedom and control, between the America of old and a reimagined version that Warren championed. But the fight was far from over. Warren's silence in the face of Kennedy's challenge was not surrender it, was the calm before a counter-offensive. The nation watched, divided and riveted, as the clash moved beyond the Senate floor, spilling into living rooms, newsrooms, and online forums. The battle for America's identity had reached a fever pitch, and the next move would shape the narrative for a country grappling with its past, its present, and its uncertain future. The Senate chamber still hummed with the aftershock of Senator John Neely Kennedy's sharp challenge to Elizabeth Warren. "If you don't believe in that America, maybe you ought to find a country that fits your blueprint." The words had landed like a well-aimed dart, stirring murmurs among senators, prompting aides to scribble notes, and drawing gasps from the gallery. As the hearing paused for a recess, the tension lingered, a quiet buzz that followed the lawmakers out of the room. The exchange hadn't set the nation ablaze, but it had sparked lively chatter in the Capitol's hallways and on niche political forums online. A few reporters tweeted about the clash, with restrained headlines like, "Kennedy and Warren spar over tax plan in Senate hearing." On platforms like X, a handful of users debated the moment, some praising Kennedy's bluntness, others defending Warren's vision. But the reaction was contained, far from a viral uproar. This was a policy debate, after all, not a cultural earthquake, and both senators knew the real test lay in swaying their colleagues and constituents, not chasing headlines. Yet, Kennedy saw an opportunity to press his advantage, aiming to outmaneuver Warren and leave her arguments faltering in a way that would sting without crossing into personal vendetta. Kennedy retreated to a quiet corner of his office, a small space cluttered with legal pads and a framed photo of his Louisiana hometown. He sat, elbows on the desk, his weathered hands clasped as he reviewed his notes. His goal hadn't been to vilify Warren, but to expose what he saw as the flaws in her wealth tax plan, a proposal he believed would choke the small businesses and entrepreneurs he championed. His challenge in the chamber, though sharp, was meant to jolt the debate, to force Warren to defend her ideas under pressure. He knew she was a formidable opponent, her progressive credentials built on years of fighting for consumers and workers, but he also knew his strength, a knack for plain talk that cut through policy jargon, connecting with people who valued hard work and limited government. As he sipped black coffee, he mapped out his next move, determined to keep Warren on the defensive without escalating to a spectacle that could backfire. Warren, meanwhile, was in her office, a tidy room lined with books and policy reports. She stood by a window, arms crossed, her glasses pushed up as she processed the exchange. Aides bustled around her, one reading X posts aloud, another drafting a response for a local news outlet. The online chatter was modest, but pointed. Some users called Kennedy's remark, savage. Others labeled it unfair, while Warren's supporters urged her to clap back. She felt the sting of his words not because they questioned her patriotism, but because they'd shifted focus from her plan's merits to a narrative of ideological extremism. Her wealth tax, designed to fund healthcare and education by taxing the ultra-rich, was her answer to an economy she saw as tilted toward the elite. Kennedy's jab had muddied that message, and she needed to regain her footing. She turned to her team, voice firm. "We stick to the facts. Let's show why this plan works." But inwardly, she braced for Kennedy's next volley, knowing he'd come prepared. The hearing's fallout played out quietly. A few political blogs covered the exchange, with titles like "Kennedy Challenges Warren in Tax Debate" and "Warren Faces Pushback on Wealth Tax." On X, the discussion was lively but niche, with a few hundred posts splitting between Kennedy fans who loved his "tell it like it is" style and Warren backers who argued he'd dodged her data. Local news in Louisiana and Massachusetts picked up the story, framing it as a classic conservative-progressive tussle. In the Senate, the mood was professional but charged, with Republican colleagues giving Kennedy subtle nods and Democrats whispering support to Warren. The real battle would unfold when the hearing resumed, where Kennedy aimed to solidify his upper hand and leave Warren's arguments unraveling, embarrassed but not destroyed, in a way that kept the debate civil and policy-focused. As the gavel fell to restart the session, the chamber settled into a focused hush. Senators leaned forward, pens ready, while the gallery, mostly staffers and a few reporters, watched closely. Warren rose first, her posture steady, her voice clear but tinged with resolve. "Mr. Chairman, colleagues, Senator Kennedy," she began, "I want to refocus on why we're here, to build an economy that works for everyone. My wealth tax targets the top 0.1%, the ultra-wealthy, who've benefited from a system that lets them pay less than teachers or nurses. The revenue, projected at $3 trillion over a decade, will fund healthcare, education, and green energy. This isn't about punishing success. It's about ensuring opportunity for all. Senator Kennedy suggests I'm out of touch with America's values. I say I'm fighting for an America where hard work pays off for everyone, not just the privileged." Her words drew nods from Democratic senators and a smattering of claps from the gallery. She cited studies showing rising inequality, 40% of Americans unable to cover a $400 emergency, and framed her plan as a practical fix, not a radical overhaul. But her delivery, while polished, felt rehearsed, and a few senators shifted in their seats, waiting for Kennedy's response. He stood, adjusting his tie with a slow, deliberate motion, a faint smile hinting at his confidence. "Mr. Chairman," he began, his Louisiana drawl warm and inviting, "Senator Warren's got a big heart, and I don't doubt she wants to help folks. But as my granddaddy used to say, good intentions don't pay the bills. Her wealth tax sounds nice on paper, but it's a hornet's nest of problems." The room chuckled, the tension easing slightly. Kennedy's eyes locked on Warren, his tone friendly but firm. "She says her tax hits only the ultra-rich, but let's look at the real world. That tax would slam family businesses, farmers, small entrepreneurs, the folks who create 2/3 of America's jobs. I talked to a diner owner in Baton Rouge last week. Employs 15 people, barely scraping by. A new tax like this? She'd have to lay off half her staff. Senator Warren says it'll raise $3 trillion. But the numbers don't add up. Studies show maybe half that. And that's before businesses start moving overseas. You don't fix a leaky pipe by drilling more holes, and you don't help workers by taxing their bosses out of business." Senators scribbled notes, some nodding as Kennedy's plain talk hit home. He gestured broadly, as if addressing a small-town crowd. "Senator Warren talks about fairness. And who's against fairness? But her plan's like trying to fix a watch with a sledgehammer. It'll hurt the middle class, she claims. To champion higher taxes mean fewer jobs, slower growth, less money in folks' pockets. I believe in an America where you keep what you earn, where the government's a referee, not a player. Her plan puts Washington in the driver's seat, and I don't trust bureaucrats to steer better than the American people. He paused, letting the words sink in, then turned to Warren with a polite but pointed edge. Senator, your heart's in the right place, but your math's off and your plan's a gamble we can't afford. The gallery murmured, a few conservative staffers clapping softly. Warren's face tightened, her earlier confidence wavering as Kennedy's logic landed. She stood to respond, her voice sharp but strained. Senator Kennedy, your stories are compelling, but they dodge the data. My plan is based on rigorous studies. $3 trillion is a conservative estimate. And it targets only the wealthiest, not small businesses. You say it'll hurt jobs. But history shows fair taxes, fuel growth. Like after World War II. I'm fighting for an America where everyone has a shot, not just the elite. But her words faltered, her usual fire dimmed by Kennedy's relentless focus on practicality. She cited a study, but mixed up a figure, $2 trillion instead of $3, trillion, prompting a ripple of whispers in the gallery and a raised eyebrow from Kennedy. He seized the opening, standing again with a nod to the chair. Senator Warren, I appreciate the numbers, but if you're off by $1 trillion, that's not a rounding error, that's a problem. The room laughed, the mood shifting firmly in his favor. Let's keep it simple. Your plan raises taxes on the folks who drive our economy. And that's a fact, not a story. I talked to a hardware store owner in Shreveport, third generation. Employs 10 people. He's not a billionaire, but your tax would hit him hard. Force him to cut hours or close shop. That's not fairness. That's hurting the folks you say you're helping. I believe in an America where hard work pays off without Washington taking a bigger slice. If that's not your America, Senator, I reckon we've got different blueprints. The words echoed his earlier challenge, but landed softer, wrapped in policy specifics that made Warren's plan seem shaky. The gallery buzzed, reporters jotting down Kennedy's quip, while Warren's face flushed. Her era and Kennedy's rebuttal leaving her visibly rattled. She tried to counter, citing another study. But her delivery was rushed, her point lost in a tangle of figures. The chair, sensing the debate tilting, called time, ending the session. Warren sat, her expression a mix of frustration and embarrassment, knowing she'd been outmaneuvered. Kennedy gathered his papers, his demeanor calm, a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. The aftermath was subdued but clear. Political blogs noted Kennedy's edge, with posts like, Kennedy outshines Warren in tax debate, gaining traction. On X, a few dozen users shared clips of his diner and hardware store anecdotes, praising his common sense, while Warren's supporters lamented her stumble. Local news in Louisiana ran brief stories cheering Kennedy's performance, while Massachusetts outlets defended Warren but noted her off day. In the Senate, colleagues moved on to other business. But Kennedy's concise, relatable arguments had swayed a few moderates, who later expressed doubts about Warren's plan in private. Warren, though stung, began revising her pitch, determined to rebound. The Senate debate between Senators John Neely Kennedy and Elizabeth Warren offers a vital lesson about the enduring power of clear, relatable communication in shaping public discourse, and the importance of staying true to practical values in a complex world. Kennedy's success in outmaneuvering Warren, leaving her momentarily embarrassed, stemmed from his ability to distill complex policy debates into stories that resonated deeply. Tales of a diner owner and a hardware store owner struggling under the weight of proposed taxes. These weren't just anecdotes, they were reflections of the real-world challenges faced by small business owners, workers, and families, many of whom are in this age group and have spent decades building lives through hard work and perseverance. His approach teaches that effective advocacy, whether in politics or personal life, relies on speaking directly to people's experiences, jobs, financial security, the pride of self-reliance rather than leaning on abstract data or grandiose promises. For an audience that values stability and has seen economic policies come and go, Kennedy's focus on protecting what works feels like a nod to their lived wisdom. This story also underscores the responsibility of seasoned citizens to engage critically with ideas, especially in a democracy where voices can shape the future. Warren stumbled tripping over a figure and losing her usual fire shows that even well-meaning plans can falter if they don't connect with practical realities. For those over 50 who've navigated life's ups and downs, this is a reminder to question proposals that sound too good to be true, to demand clarity, and to prioritize solutions that respect the grit it takes to thrive. The educational takeaway is clear. You don't need to be a senator to make a difference. By sharing your perspective, whether in community meetings, family discussions, or voting grounded in the lessons of experience, you can influence debates and preserve the values that have sustained you. Kennedy's edge in this story inspires older viewers to speak up with confidence, using their hard-earned insight to advocate for an America where hard work still pays off, ensuring their voices remain a cornerstone of a vibrant democracy.